She killed the man who owned her. And the reason why will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice in America. This is the story they don't teach in schools, and you need to hear it. In 1855, a 14-year-old girl was bought like property. For 5 years, she suffered things no human being should ever experience. And when she finally fought back, the law didn't protect her, it condemned her. Her name was Celia, and her story is one of the most heartbreaking cases in American history. Today, we're going to talk about what really happened, how the legal system failed her, and why this case still matters today. And I have to warn you, this story is going to be tough to hear, but it's important. So, let's get into it. Here's what you need to understand about America in the 1850s. The law didn't see enslaved people as human beings. They were property, objects, things you could buy and sell. And because of that, they had zero rights. None. They couldn't testify in court against white people. They couldn't defend themselves legally. They couldn't own anything. They couldn't even protect their own bodies. Now, when we learn about slavery in school, we usually hear the big picture stuff. We hear about cotton fields and plantations. We hear about the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln. We hear dates and numbers and facts that feel distant and historical. But we don't always hear the individual stories, the real people, the ones who lived through it day after day. And that's a problem, because when history becomes just dates and facts, we forget that these were real human beings with thoughts and feelings and dreams. People who wanted the same things we all want: safety, dignity, freedom, love, the chance to make their own choices. Celia's story forces us to look at one person, one life, one impossible situation. And when you zoom in like that, when you really look at what happened to her, it becomes so much harder to treat this as just history. It becomes real. It becomes personal. It becomes something that makes you angry and sad and confused about how this was ever allowed to happen. So let me take you back to the year 1850, to a quiet stretch of farmland in Callaway County, Missouri. It was a place where the land rolled gently, where the fields stretched to the horizon, and where one man, Robert Newsom, lived a life that others in his community considered successful. He was 60 years old, a widower whose wife had passed away not long before. His grown children had moved away, leaving him mostly alone. He owned a decent-sized farm, and like many white landowners of his time, he also owned several enslaved people who worked that land. By the standards of that era, people saw him as a respectable man, a citizen, a man of property and status. But behind that calm image, there was something far darker about to unfold. In June of 1850, Robert Newsom traveled to a neighboring county with the intention of purchasing another enslaved worker. The person he chose was a young girl named Celia, only 14 years old. A child, really. But in that time and place, her youth meant nothing. Her feelings meant nothing. Her humanity meant nothing. Under the law, she was seen not as a person, but as property. And that one cruel fact would define the rest of her short life. From the very beginning, Celia's world was filled with fear. When she was taken to Newsom's farm, it quickly became clear that she had not been bought for field labor. She was forced into a life of suffering, trapped in a situation she could not escape. That first night marked the start of a terrible pattern that would last for 5 long years. Each day, Celia worked as expected, but each night she lived in terror. She was isolated, powerless, and completely at the mercy of a man who viewed her not as human, but as something he could control. Now, we have to pause for a moment to understand the world she lived in. At that time, Missouri had laws that said no man could harm or violate a woman without facing punishment. But those protections were not meant for everyone. They applied only to white women. Enslaved women were given no legal protection at all. That meant that if someone mistreated an enslaved woman, there was no crime in the eyes of the law. No justice, no recognition. If she tried to defend herself, she could be beaten, sold, or even killed for resisting. It's almost impossible to imagine the cruelty of such a system, a legal structure that punished the victim and protected the one causing harm. It was built to keep people like Celia silent, powerless, and broken. So, Celia lived each day knowing there was no way out. Her cabin stood just a short distance from Newsom's main house, close enough for him to come whenever he pleased. And for 5 long years, that's exactly what happened. She had nowhere to run, no one to tell, and no law that would ever take her side. As time passed, Celia tried to hold on to anything that gave her a sense of humanity, anything that reminded her she was more than what her world tried to make her. And during those years, she formed a relationship with another enslaved man on the farm named George. He was kind to her. He listened to her. For the first time in years, she found something like love, a brief moment of peace in a life filled with suffering. But even that small bit of hope could not shield her from what she faced. Robert Newsom continued to treat her as his possession, as though nothing had changed. He refused to respect her boundaries or her pain. He felt entitled to control every part of her life. George knew what was happening. He saw her pain, her fear, her exhaustion, and yet he could do almost nothing to protect her. If he tried to stand up to Newsom, he would be severely punished, beaten, sold, or even killed. The law offered him no power, no voice, no chance to intervene. He was angry, frustrated, and heartbroken. And eventually, he told Celia something that changed everything. He told her she needed to make it stop, that if she didn't find a way to end what Newsom was doing, he couldn't continue their relationship. It was an impossible situation for Celia. She was caught between 2 forces, one violent, one desperate, and neither offered her true safety. She was tired, afraid, and without hope. For 5 years, she had endured something no one should ever have to endure, and the people around her, even those who cared for her, had no way to help. That's the world Celia lived in, a world where one man's power meant another person's complete suffering. And yet, despite everything, she held on. She endured day after day, trapped in a system designed to silence her. But soon, something inside her would begin to change, and the quiet endurance that had defined her life for 5 long years was about to turn into resistance. Put yourself in Celia's position for a moment. She was a young woman trapped in an impossible life. Every single day, she lived under the control of a man who owned her, a man who could decide what she did, where she went, and even whether she could speak up for herself. She couldn't turn to the law for help because the law wasn't made to protect her. She couldn't run away because being caught would mean brutal punishment or death. And she couldn't fight back because defending herself against a man in power could cost her everything. Now imagine the one person she cared about, the one person who gave her even a small glimpse of love and hope, turned to her and said it was her responsibility to make it stop, to end something she had no power to end, to fix something that the world itself had made unfixable. And if she couldn't do that, he would leave her. He would walk away, and she would lose the only good thing in her life. What would you do? What could you do? By the year 1855, Celia was 19 years old, still so young, yet already carrying the weight of a lifetime of pain. She was expecting another child. It wasn't her first. The records show that she had already given birth twice before, both times under the same circumstances, trapped in a world where she had no say, no rights, and no safety. Now she was exhausted, her body was weak, her mind was overwhelmed. She had lived through 5 years of constant fear and had finally reached her breaking point. In her desperation, Celia did something incredibly brave. She spoke up. She went to the man who controlled her and asked him to stop visiting her cabin. She told him she wasn't well, that she was expecting, and that she needed peace. Imagine the courage it took to stand before someone who had absolute power over your life and ask for mercy. But he refused. He told her that he could do as he pleased, because the law said he could, because society said he could, because to him she wasn't a person, she was property. And that was the moment Celia realized that no one would save her. If she wanted this to end, she would have to end it herself. So she made a choice. A desperate, terrifying, heartbreaking choice. One born not out of anger, but of survival. She decided that if he came again, she would protect herself, whatever it took. On the night of June 23, 1855, the house was quiet. Everyone else was asleep. And then, just like so many nights before, the sound of footsteps approached her cabin. It was him. But this time, Celia was ready. She had placed a heavy stick near her bed, not as a weapon of vengeance, but as her last line of defense. As the door opened, she stood trembling, knowing what was about to happen. When he came closer, she found her voice, a voice that had been silenced for years. She told him to stop. She told him to leave her alone. She said no. But he didn't listen. He kept moving toward her. And that was when Celia, pushed to the absolute edge of fear and desperation, lifted the stick and struck him once. A single, panicked motion. He fell to the floor, and for a moment there was silence. Celia froze, her heart racing. She hadn't meant to take a life. She only wanted to make him stop, to make the nightmare stop. But the blow was harder than she realized. Or maybe he fell the wrong way. Whatever the reason, he didn't get up, and in that instant, everything changed. Celia stood there, a 19-year-old woman, staring at the impossible. The man who had ruled over her for years was gone. For the first time, she was free from his control. But she also knew what that meant. Because even though she had acted in fear and self-defense, the law would never see it that way. The law didn't care about her suffering. It didn't recognize her humanity. To the system, she wasn't a young woman who had defended herself. She was simply an enslaved person who had killed her master. And in 1855 Missouri, that meant one thing: a death sentence. Celia panicked. Who wouldn't? She had just done something unthinkable. Something that, in her world, meant certain death. She knew exactly what would happen if anyone found out. So she tried to hide what she had done. That night, she worked in silence. The air was heavy with fear. She gathered what she could, trembling, thinking through the impossible. Inside her small cabin, she started a fire. A fire meant to erase every trace of what had happened. Through the long hours of the night, Celia kept the fire alive. The glow lit the walls, the smoke filled the air, and she stayed awake, feeding the flames again and again, desperate to make everything disappear. By dawn, there was almost nothing left, only ashes and small fragments, which she quietly scattered outside her cabin, along the path where no one would notice. But secrets never stay hidden forever. The next morning, Robert Newsom's family realized he was gone. They searched the fields, the barns, and the surrounding woods. They called out his name. And when they found no sign of him, they turned to the people who worked on the farm. The enslaved men and women who had no power to refuse their questions. Eventually, they questioned Celia. Now, this is important. Celia could have lied. She could have said she didn't know anything. But she didn't. When they asked her what happened, she told them the truth. She confessed. She explained what had led her to that moment. She told them about the years of cruelty and fear, about begging him to leave her alone, about wanting only peace. Why did she confess? Maybe she believed honesty would bring mercy. Maybe she hoped someone, anyone, would finally understand. Or maybe she was just tired. Tired of hiding. Tired of running. Tired of living in fear. Because in her heart, she probably knew that no matter what she said, there was no way out. She was arrested immediately. A young, pregnant woman, exhausted and frightened, was taken from her cabin and locked in a small jail cell to await trial. She was sick. She was traumatized. And now she was completely alone, waiting to learn if she would live or die. Here's where the story becomes even more heartbreaking. Because yes, Celia was given a trial. But from the very beginning, it was never truly fair. It was designed to lead to one outcome: guilt. Her lawyers were appointed by the court. They didn't volunteer, but to their credit, they tried. They built a defense based on one clear truth. Celia had acted in self-defense. They pointed to Missouri law, the same law that said women had the right to protect themselves from unwanted harm. And they argued that this law should protect Celia too. It was a powerful argument, logical, just. If any white woman had suffered years of cruelty and then finally fought back to save herself, would she be treated as a murderer? Almost certainly not. There would be sympathy. There would be understanding. But Celia's case was different because of who she was. The prosecution's argument was chilling. They said those laws didn't apply to Celia because, under Missouri's legal system, she wasn't considered a woman. She was legally defined as property. And property, they said, couldn't defend itself from its owner. Think about that. A human being standing in court being told that her life and body had no legal value because of her skin color. The judge agreed with the prosecution. He instructed the jury to ignore the idea of self-defense. He told them that the law protecting women did not extend to enslaved women, and therefore what Celia did could only be called murder. The jury took hours to deliberate. You can sense the conflict in their silence. They knew what had happened to her was wrong. They heard her story. They understood her pain. But in the end, they followed the law as it was written. The verdict? Guilty. The sentence? Death by hanging. Her lawyers immediately filed an appeal. They argued that the instructions were unjust, that Celia had been denied equal protection. They took her case to the Missouri Supreme Court, hoping that someone, somewhere, would see reason. But the Supreme Court refused to hear it. They didn't even review the arguments. Celia's fate was sealed. To understand why this happened, we have to zoom out. Because Celia's trial wasn't just about her. It was about a country on the edge of breaking apart. It was 1855, a time when America was split in two over slavery. In the North, states were fighting to abolish it. In the South, slavery was defended as a way of life. The nation was boiling, and Missouri sat dangerously close to the fire. In Kansas, just across Missouri's border, people were killing each other over whether it would enter the Union as a free or slave state. Missouri was caught in the middle, a slave state standing beside free territories, and fear was everywhere. White slaveholders were terrified that enslaved people might rise up, rebel, or fight back. Every whisper of defiance felt like a spark that could ignite a war. So when Celia killed her master, it wasn't seen as one woman defending herself. It was seen as a threat to the entire system. If the court admitted that an enslaved woman had the right to defend herself, what message would that send? What if others did the same? The legal foundation of slavery would begin to crumble. And so, the court did what it always did. It protected the system, not the person. Celia's execution was meant to send a message: if you resist, you will be destroyed. She wasn't killed because of what she did. She was killed because of what her act represented. She became a symbol of defiance in a world built on control, a spark of human dignity in a time of cruelty and silence. While waiting for her execution, something unexpected happened. Someone helped Celia escape. No one knows exactly who it was. Maybe one of her lawyers, maybe George, the man who cared for her, or maybe a stranger who heard her story and wanted to help. But one night, her cell was empty. For the first time in years, Celia was free. For a few precious weeks, she lived outside the walls of that jail. Maybe she felt a small flicker of hope, the idea that life could start again, that maybe she could raise her children, that maybe she could find safety. But her freedom didn't last. She was found, captured, and brought back. And this time, the jailers made sure she would never escape again. Whoever helped her, their name was never recorded. But that person gave Celia something priceless, the chance to feel free, even if only for a moment. On December 21, 1855, Celia was led from her cell to the gallows. She was just 20 years old. She had recently given birth, she was weak, and she was about to die under the same laws that had refused to protect her. We don't know much about that morning. The records are sparse. But we know enough. We know that she was calm. We know that she walked to the platform with quiet dignity. And we know that there were no protests, no outrage, no mercy. Because in 1855 Missouri, this was not seen as injustice. This was seen as justice fulfilled. A person who had fought back against the system was punished by it. To most, the story ended there. But it shouldn't end there. Celia's story forces us to ask hard questions. Questions about justice, power, and humanity. Who gets to claim self-defense? Who is seen as worthy of protection? And who is left behind by the law? Celia's name was nearly forgotten for more than a century, but history has remembered her, not as a criminal, but as a symbol of courage in an era of cruelty. Her life reminds us that even in the darkest systems, there are moments of resistance. Moments when one voice, no matter how small, dares to say enough. Let's pause and look at the legal side of Celia's story, because it shows just how twisted and unjust the system really was. In the mid-1800s, Missouri actually had laws that were meant to protect women from harm. These laws stated clearly that a woman had the right to defend herself, even to the point of using deadly force, if someone tried to violate her personal safety. On paper, that seemed fair. In fact, by the standards of that time, those laws looked almost progressive. But there was a hidden clause, not written in words, but built into how society worked. When the law said woman, it didn't mean all women. It meant white women. Enslaved women were excluded. The courts didn't even recognize them as women in a legal sense. To the system, they were classified as property. Celia's lawyers tried to challenge that. They argued that the word woman in the law should apply to every woman, no matter her race or status. It seems like common sense now. Of course, all women are women. But in 1855 Missouri, that was a radical idea. It threatened the very foundation of slavery. Because if the law recognized that enslaved women were women, then they would have rights. And if they had rights, slavery itself would begin to collapse. The judge didn't allow that argument. He stated clearly that the protection laws applied only to white women. The jury, bound by his instructions, had no real choice. Even if they personally believed that what happened to Celia was wrong, they were told to convict her because the law demanded it. This is what we mean when we talk about systemic injustice. It wasn't just about cruel individuals. It was about an entire structure designed to treat people differently based on who they were. A system where justice depended not on what you did, but on who you were. There's another crucial part of the law we need to understand. Under Missouri law at the time, enslaved people could not legally consent to anything. They couldn't sign contracts, couldn't marry, couldn't own property, and couldn't make legal decisions about their own lives. So here's the question. If someone is legally forbidden from giving or denying consent, how could they possibly agree to a relationship with the person who owns them? The truth is, they couldn't. No matter what the circumstances were, no matter what appearances might suggest, the power imbalance was absolute. Every interaction was defined by ownership, not choice. Yet the law did not see it that way. It claimed that an enslaver had full rights over the people they owned. That meant that any resistance, even self-defense, could be punished, and any cruelty could be excused. This made abuse not just possible, but legal. It turned injustice into a normal part of everyday life. And Missouri wasn't alone. Across the American South, this was the standard. Enslaved women had no legal protection from harm, and when they bore children as a result of their oppression, those children were also born into slavery. That created a horrific cycle, because enslavers had a financial incentive to continue this system. Every new child born into slavery meant more labor, more workers, and more profit. The cruelty wasn't just tolerated, it was profitable. This system was designed not simply to control people, but to erase their humanity and turn them into tools of wealth. Among the most tragic parts of Celia's story is what happened to her children. She had two, and she was expecting a third when she was executed. Those children were now orphans, and because of the law, they were still considered property. History doesn't tell us what became of them. The records fall silent. But we can guess based on what usually happened. Most likely, they were sold or given to others. Maybe they stayed with Robert Newsom's family. Maybe they were separated, sold to different farms or owners. We'll never know for sure. But imagine what that meant. Those children grew up without their mother, a mother who had been taken from them for trying to defend herself. They grew up enslaved in the same system that had destroyed her. And the child Celia was carrying when she died never got the chance to live. That life ended before it began, on the same day Celia's did, December 21st, 1855. This is what slavery did. It didn't just harm the people trapped in it. It tore apart families. It created grief that stretched across generations. It left scars so deep they could never fully heal. So why talk about this now? Why should we remember something that happened nearly 170 years ago? Because the questions raised by Celia's story still echo today. She was denied justice because the legal system refused to see her as fully human. The law protected her abuser and punished her for defending herself. And if you think about it, that's not just ancient history. That's a pattern we've seen repeated throughout American history, in different forms. After slavery ended, new systems replaced it. Laws that separated, restricted, and controlled. Jim Crow laws kept Black Americans from voting, from owning homes in certain areas, from going to certain schools. The rules changed, but the idea stayed the same, that some lives mattered more than others. Even today, we see echoes of this inequality. We see victims who aren't believed. We see people punished harshly for defending themselves. We see justice that shifts based on race, class, or status. Celia's story forces us to face these uncomfortable truths. And it also reminds us how history is told, or too often not told. Because Celia's name doesn't appear in most school textbooks, her story is rarely mentioned in classrooms. Why? Because it makes people uncomfortable. It forces us to look at what slavery really was. Not just an economic system, but a system built on violence, ownership, and the denial of human dignity. When these stories are left out, history becomes cleaner, easier, but also false. Because the reality of slavery was not abstract. It was personal. It was human. It was full of people like Celia, who lived, suffered, resisted, and mattered. Let's go back to Celia's trial, because what happened inside that courtroom reveals something deeply troubling about how the legal system worked in her time. Celia's lawyers truly tried to defend her. They weren't simply filling a role or pretending to care. They built a serious defense. Thoughtful, organized, and grounded in evidence. They called witnesses who knew what had been happening on the farm. They described the conditions Celia lived under and the years of mistreatment she endured. They explained how she had pleaded for it to stop, how she had reached her breaking point, and how she acted only to protect herself when she was cornered with no other way out. In any fair and humane legal system, this would have mattered. Evidence like that should have led to an acquittal, or at the very least a reduced charge. But none of it mattered. Because long before the jury gave their verdict, the judge had already decided what the outcome would be. When the judge told the jury that an enslaved woman had no legal right to defend herself against her enslaver, he effectively took away the heart of Celia's defense. His words told the jurors that no matter what evidence they heard, no matter what truth was revealed, they were expected to convict her. This was not justice. It was a miscarriage of justice. A moment where the process of law looked proper on the surface but was entirely hollow inside. Celia was granted a trial, but it wasn't a real one. It was a performance, a legal ritual meant to appear fair while hiding the fact that the verdict had already been written. Think about what that means. A young woman who had already endured years of cruelty finally stood before the court to tell her truth. And yet, that truth was treated as irrelevant. The courtroom, which should have been a place of fairness and reason, became another tool of oppression. And here's the part that exposes the hypocrisy most clearly. The same judge who ruled that Celia had no right to defend herself would never have made that decision if the situation were reversed. If a white woman had killed an enslaved man who tried to harm her, the case would have been over in a day. She would have been praised for her courage. The community would have called her brave, a woman who defended her honor. But Celia was not white. She was black. She was enslaved. And in that world, those facts changed everything. The law, which claimed to be blind, could see color all too clearly. It saw race, it saw ownership, and it made its decisions based on those things. Justice was not determined by right or wrong, but by who had power and who did not. So even though Celia's defense team fought with logic, evidence, and compassion, they were never truly fighting for a verdict. They were fighting against a system designed to silence her from the start. And in that battle, the outcome was already written before the first word was spoken. Celia's case was tragic, but it was not an isolated one. It represented a much larger, darker pattern that stretched across the history of slavery in America. During that time, countless enslaved women endured treatment similar to what Celia suffered. And when they tried to resist, when they dared to stand up for themselves, the system turned against them. Historical records reveal other stories, stories of women who tried to defend themselves from men who controlled them completely. Most of them faced the same outcome. They were found guilty and punished with the harshest possible sentences. The message from society and the courts was unmistakable. If you were enslaved, you had no rights, no voice, no power to protect yourself. The entire structure of law and order existed to maintain this cruel system and crush anyone who tried to resist it. There were also cases of enslaved men and women who rose against overseers or white citizens who mistreated them, and again, the result was always the same: conviction, punishment, sometimes even death. Every decision sent a clear signal to the enslaved population: you have no protection, you have no voice, you must obey, no matter what happens. This created a world ruled by fear, A world where every enslaved person woke up knowing that if someone hurt them, no justice would follow. They couldn't appeal to the authorities because the authorities were the ones enforcing their suffering. They couldn't defend themselves because the law said they had no right to. And they couldn't escape because capture meant brutal consequences. They were trapped in every sense of the word, legally, physically, and emotionally. And it's vital to understand, this was not an accident. It was deliberate. The laws of that era were designed to deny them personhood. Courtrooms were built to protect the powerful, not the powerless. The entire machinery of government was structured to preserve slavery and to crush anyone who tried to resist it. But Celia's story doesn't end with her. What became of the others who surrounded her? The man who owned her, his family, the man she cared about, and the others on that farm. After Robert Newsom's death, his property, including the land and the enslaved people, passed to his children. That likely included Celia's own children. They continued living as enslaved people for another decade until the Civil War finally ended the institution in 1865. As for the Newsom family, there is no record of them questioning what their father had done or speaking against slavery. There's no evidence that they saw Celia as a victim. To them, as to many white families of that era, she was viewed only through the lens of property, someone who had broken the rules of an unjust system and was punished for it. And then there was George, the man Celia cared for deeply. History does not tell us what became of him. He might have been sold after the trial, he might have stayed on the farm, or he might have found freedom during the chaos of the Civil War. No one knows for sure, but imagine what he must have carried with him. The woman he loved was gone. She died, in part, because he had urged her to stop the man who controlled her life, something she had no real power to do. It's impossible to know what went through his mind, but it's easy to imagine the weight of that memory, the guilt, the grief, the helplessness. He likely thought about her every day, probably replayed their last conversations, wishing he had said or done something different, wishing he had found some way to save her. But what could he have done? He lived under the same oppressive system that destroyed her. He too was denied power, denied freedom, denied any chance to protect the people he loved. That's what slavery did to people. It didn't just take away their freedom, it trapped them in impossible situations, where every choice led to pain, where every road ended in loss, where survival itself was an act of courage. After Celia's execution, the world didn't suddenly change. The laws that failed her remained in place. The system that denied her humanity continued to function. And Missouri, like much of the South, remained a slave state. For years, her name faded into silence, while the machinery of injustice kept turning. The courts that ignored her pain continued to ignore the pain of thousands more. The law didn't see her as a person, and it would take a national war to finally challenge that lie. The Civil War began in 1861, just 6 years after Celia's death. By 1865, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution finally abolished slavery across the nation. For the first time in history, millions of people who had been treated as property were declared free. But freedom, as it turned out, did not mean equality. After the war, the South introduced a new system of oppression, the Jim Crow laws. These laws didn't enslave people outright, but they achieved something chillingly similar. They separated, restricted, and discriminated. They sent a clear message that freedom didn't mean fairness, and equality would not come easily. Generations of Black Americans continued to live under laws that denied them education, opportunity, and dignity. The system was different in name, but familiar in spirit, built on the same poisonous idea that some lives mattered less than others. It would take another century and the courage of the civil rights movement of the 1960s to begin breaking that system down. Brave men and women marched, spoke, and risked everything to push the nation toward justice. And yet, even after all that, the struggle wasn't over. We still live with the echoes of those injustices today. Celia's story reminds us that progress is never permanent. Every generation has to protect it, every generation has to fight for it. Because the rights we take for granted, the right to be safe, to be heard, to be treated as human, can disappear if we stop defending them. Celia's case is a part of that long, unfinished fight. It is a reminder of where we once were, how far we've come, and how much further we still have to go. For more than a century, Celia's name was nearly forgotten. Her story was buried in dusty ledgers and hidden in forgotten archives. Just another footnote in a nation's dark history. Another young woman erased by a system that had already taken everything from her. Then, in the 1990s, a historian named Melton McLaurin decided to look deeper. He searched through old records, faded handwriting, and court transcripts. Piece by piece, he began to rebuild Celia's world, not from her own words, because none were preserved, but from the fragments left behind by others. In 1991, he published a book titled Celia, a Slave. For the first time, the world heard her story again. McLaurin's research brought Celia back into the public eye. It revealed not just the horror of what happened to her, but the chilling indifference of a society that allowed it. His work reminded us that history isn't just about presidents, generals, or great battles. It's also about ordinary people. People who lived and suffered in silence. People whose courage was never recognized. Since McLaurin's book, many other historians have revisited Celia's case. They've examined the legal arguments made during her trial, the political climate of Missouri in the 1850s, and the impossible choices faced by enslaved women at that time. Each new piece of research adds another layer of understanding, another glimpse into a world built on cruelty and survival. But even now, there's so much we'll never know. We don't know what Celia thought as the years passed. We don't know what she dreamed about, what she prayed for, or what she whispered to her children at night. We don't know how she saw herself, as a mother, a fighter, a survivor, because her voice was never recorded. That silence is part of the tragedy. Slavery didn't just steal lives, it stole voices, it erased stories. It turned human beings into statistics and left behind only fragments for us to interpret. All we have of Celia are those fragments, the court records, the testimonies, the words written by others. But through them, we can still feel her presence. We can still hear, faintly, the echo of a young woman who dared to resist a system that denied her humanity. And that echo is powerful, because as long as we remember her, as long as her story is told, Celia is no longer just a name in a file. She becomes what history once tried to erase, a voice, a person, a symbol of defiance against injustice. Celia's story isn't the only one of its kind. Throughout American history, there have been countless moments when the justice system turned its back on the very people it was meant to protect. Moments when the law became a weapon instead of a shield. Take, for example, the 1944 case of Racy Taylor in Alabama. She was a black woman walking home from church when she was attacked by a group of white men. She went straight to the police, told the truth, and demanded justice. But the system looked the other way. The men were never charged, never punished. Why? Because at that time, society refused to believe that a black woman's pain mattered. That wasn't an isolated story. There are countless examples throughout history where people who were victimized and tried to defend themselves ended up being punished more harshly than the people who hurt them. People who faced cruelty, stood up for themselves, and were branded as criminals for doing so. These moments reveal a painful pattern. A pattern where the promise of equal justice under the law didn't always mean equal in reality. On paper, the law claimed to protect everyone, In practice, it protected some far more than others. It created invisible lines of privilege and power, deciding whose voice would be heard and whose suffering could be ignored. Celia's story is one of the most extreme examples because she had no legal rights at all. In the world she lived in, she wasn't seen as a person in the eyes of the law. But the idea that some lives matter more than others, that some people deserve protection while others don't, is a shadow that still lingers in parts of society even today. Her story forces us to confront that uncomfortable truth. It reminds us that justice without humanity is no justice at all. Now, let's pause for a moment and try to understand what all of this meant for Celia as a person. Because we've talked about laws, trials, and history, but behind those words was a real human being, a young girl who endured unimaginable suffering and still tried to hold on to her dignity. Imagine being 14 years old and suddenly torn away from your home, placed under the control of someone much older, and stripped of your freedom. Imagine realizing that you have no power, no safety, no escape, and that every day could bring new fear. Now imagine that lasting not for days or months, but for 5 long years. 5 years of being treated as less than human. 5 years of knowing that no one would listen even if you screamed for help. 5 years of enduring pain in silence while the world around you pretended nothing was wrong. And then imagine that the one person you care about, the only person who ever shows you kindness, tells you that if you can't find a way to make the suffering stop, your relationship will end. The emotional pressure of that moment must have been unbearable. She was caught between fear, love, and hopelessness, with no path forward that didn't lead to more pain. By 1855, Celia was exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally. She was ill, expecting another child, and pushed far beyond her limits. At that point, she made a choice no one should ever have to make. She chose to protect herself, a decision born not from anger, but from survival. And in defending herself, her entire world collapsed. When everything came crashing down, she didn't hide from what she had done. She told the truth. She explained her suffering, hoping that someone, anyone, would understand. She believed that honesty might bring compassion, that justice might finally see her humanity. But it didn't. The court told her that her truth didn't matter, that her suffering wasn't enough, that she had no right to defend her own life. Think about the weight of that, the betrayal, the despair of realizing that your voice means nothing in the system that decides your fate. The emotional toll of Celia's story is beyond comprehension. She lived through years of trauma, through constant fear and hopelessness, and yet she continued to work, to care for her children, and to survive in a world designed to break her spirit. And in the end, she faced death with the understanding that justice would never be hers, that history might remember her as a criminal instead of a young woman who fought back against unbearable cruelty. Her final days must have been filled with loneliness, fear, and the faint hope that one day someone would tell her story honestly. Slavery didn't just destroy bodies, it tried to destroy souls. It was a system built on constant mental and emotional harm, telling human beings every day that they were worthless, powerless, and invisible. It was a kind of cruelty that went beyond physical suffering. It reached into the mind, twisting identity, erasing hope, and replacing it with submission. Some people couldn't survive that. Some lost their will to keep fighting. But others, like Celia, refused to let their humanity be erased. They resisted, not always with weapons, but with courage, with spirit, and with the belief that they were human, even if the world refused to see it. Celia's courage came at a terrible cost. But through her pain, she exposed the truth of a system that was never about justice or morality. It was about power. And by standing up, even in her final moments, she reclaimed something that could never be taken away: her dignity. That is Celia's legacy. Not just tragedy, but strength. Not just suffering, but defiance. And that is why, even now, more than a century later, her story still speaks to us. It reminds us that the fight for justice is never just about laws, it's about people. And that every person, no matter who they are, deserves to be seen, heard, and protected. There's an idea that often appears in history books or classroom discussions, an idea that some enslavers were somehow kind, that a few of them treated the people they held in bondage with respect, that maybe, just maybe, not every slave owner was cruel. Robert Newsom was one of those men people might have called good in his time. By the standards of 1850s Missouri, he wasn't known for using constant violence. He didn't have a reputation for breaking up families or punishing his workers without reason. To his white neighbors, he might have seemed like a decent man, hard-working, polite, respected. But that illusion collapses when you look at what slavery truly was, because there's no such thing as a good slave owner. The act of owning another human being is already an act of cruelty. It doesn't matter if someone is gentle with their words or claims to be fair. The moment you claim ownership over a person's life, their body, their labor, their choices, you are participating in something evil. Robert Newsom may not have been the most violent enslaver in Missouri, but he was still part of that same system. He still purchased a 14-year-old girl named Celia. He still controlled every aspect of her life. He still treated her not as a person, but as something that existed for his use. He ignored her pain. He ignored her pleas. He acted as if she had no right to dignity, to rest, or to freedom. That's not kindness. That's not decency. That's abuse, plain and simple. And the most disturbing part is that people around him saw this as normal. It was legal. It was accepted. A man could destroy a life, and society would still call him respectable. That tells you everything you need to know about how twisted that system was. A society that praises men like that isn't civilized. It's corrupted at its very core. So when people today talk about good slave owners, understand what that really means. It's not history being honest. It's history trying to make people feel comfortable. It's a story created to soften the truth, to cover up the horror, to make a system built on cruelty sound somehow reasonable. But there was no kindness in slavery. There were only degrees of control. Every single person who owned another human being, whether they were outwardly cruel or outwardly gentle, was part of the same evil. Because you can't own a person and still call yourself good. Now, let's talk about something that often gets overlooked: the other enslaved people who lived on that farm with Celia. Because she wasn't alone. There were others there, men and women who worked the same fields, cooked the same meals, endured the same fear. They must have known what was happening. They probably saw the signs, heard the footsteps, heard the pain. They must have known Celia was suffering. So why didn't they help her? Why didn't they stop it? Why didn't they fight for her? The painful truth is, they couldn't. They were trapped in the same system that trapped her. If they had spoken up, they would have faced punishment too. If they had tried to resist, they could have been beaten, sold, or even killed. The system didn't just enslave bodies, it enslaved fear. That's one of the most horrifying things about slavery. It didn't just divide races, it divided the enslaved themselves. It made it dangerous to trust each other. It made it dangerous to care too loudly. Many slave owners encouraged this division deliberately. They offered small rewards to those who reported on others: extra food, better clothing, a few words of praise. They created an atmosphere of suspicion and silence where no one could be sure who to trust. A single whisper could destroy a life. So when we ask why the others didn't protect Celia, we have to remember, This was by design. The system was built to isolate people like her, to make sure that no one could stand together, to make sure that even love, friendship, and loyalty could be turned into weapons against them. But we can't judge them for their silence. They weren't villains. They were survivors. They were doing what they could to stay alive in an impossible situation. When every day is a test of endurance, sometimes survival itself becomes the only form of resistance left. Some try to cooperate with their owners, not because they wanted to, but because it was the only way to protect their children or their partners. Some stayed quiet because they knew that one wrong word could destroy the people they cared about most. That doesn't make them weak, it makes them human. Still, that isolation meant that Celia was alone in a way that few of us can truly understand. Even surrounded by people who felt her pain, she had no one she could turn to. The system made sure of that. It broke trust, it broke hope, it broke community. So when Celia finally reached her breaking point, when she decided that she could not endure another night of terror, she faced that decision completely alone. No one could save her. No one could protect her. And yet, she still found the strength to fight back. Her story is not just a tragedy. It's a reflection of a world that was built to crush people like her. And yet, somehow, she stood up anyway. Celia's story forces us to face one of the hardest questions in history, the question of resistance. When is it justified to fight back? What happens when someone is pushed beyond their limits, when every peaceful option is gone, and silence only leads to more suffering? Throughout the long and painful history of slavery, enslaved people resisted in many ways. Some bold, some quiet, all courageous. Some ran away in the dark of night, risking everything for a chance at freedom. Some worked slowly, or broke tools to interrupt the system that oppressed them. Some secretly learned to read, even when it was forbidden by law. Some kept their African songs, stories, and faith alive, passing them down in whispers and rhythm. And some, though very few, organized uprisings, choosing to fight openly against impossible odds. But violent resistance carried an unbearable price, because in that world, if an enslaved person stood up to a white person, especially to their enslaver, the punishment was death. There was no trial that could save them. The law itself guaranteed their destruction. So most chose quiet resistance, the kind that let them survive another day. But sometimes survival wasn't enough. Sometimes the pain became too much. Sometimes there came a moment when silence felt like death itself, when the only thing left to do was fight back, even knowing what the end would be. That's where Celia found herself. She had tried everything that wasn't violent. She begged her enslaver to stop. She pleaded for mercy. She asked to be left in peace. But nothing changed. And when every word, every prayer, and every tear failed, she chose to protect herself. Was she right to do that? From a moral standpoint, yes. She had every right to defend her body and her dignity. But from a legal standpoint, no. The law said she had no such right. And that is the deepest tragedy of her story. The law itself was unjust. It was written to protect the oppressor, not the oppressed. This is what happens when a legal system exists not to protect people, but to preserve power. When the law is unjust, obeying it means accepting injustice. But breaking it, even for the sake of justice, can mean losing your life. Celia was trapped in that impossible space, between what was right and what was legal. She could either endure endless suffering or fight back and face execution. Those weren't choices. That was a cruel illusion of choice. She had no way to win. And yet, by standing up for herself, Celia showed the kind of courage that history rarely recognizes. The courage to fight back against a system designed to silence her completely. Religion played a powerful role in the world Celia lived in. It shaped minds, justified beliefs, and divided people on one of humanity's greatest moral battles, slavery. Some used religion to defend it, pointing to ancient texts that seemed to support servitude and claiming God had created different races for different purposes. They said it was part of a divine plan, that the enslaved should accept their fate with obedience. But others read the same scriptures and saw messages of compassion, justice, and freedom. They argued that all humans were created equal, made in the image of God, and that enslaving another human being was a sin against that truth. And yet, when it came to Celia's life, religion failed her. The people who could have spoken up, who could have said, "This is wrong," who could have demanded justice, stayed silent. Church leaders did not protest. The faithful did not gather to defend her. The moral voices of the time looked away. Why? Because in much of the South, religion had been reshaped to serve slavery, not challenge it. Preachers told enslaved people to obey their masters. They taught that suffering on earth would be rewarded in heaven, and that rebelling against one's enslaver was the same as rebelling against God. This was religion distorted by power, stripped of its compassion, emptied of its justice. It became not a path to freedom, but a tool of control, a weapon used to keep people silent and afraid. There were, of course, brave voices who saw through this lie, abolitionists who fought slavery precisely because of their faith. But most of them lived far from Missouri, far from Celia's world, and their influence could not reach her. In the place and time where she lived, religion stood on the wrong side of justice. The very thing that should have been her comfort, her shield, her refuge, became another instrument of oppression, another force telling her to obey, another silence that condemned her. Celia's story reminds us that when faith and power intertwine, truth is often the first casualty. When religion stops speaking for the oppressed, it stops speaking for God. And when good people stay silent in the face of cruelty, silence itself becomes a sin. Let's talk about why slavery existed in the first place. Because it wasn't only about racism, though that was a huge part of it. It was also money, enormous amounts of money. Slavery was one of the most profitable systems in human history. Enslaved people worked without pay, producing the cotton, tobacco, and sugar that powered the Southern economy. Their labor built fortunes, funded industries, and shaped the economy of the United States itself. Robert Newsom wasn't a powerful plantation owner, but even he benefited from the system. The people he enslaved worked his farm. Their labor created his income. And when enslaved women had children, those children automatically became his property too. More people meant more wealth, an ever-growing cycle of exploitation disguised as business. This economic motivation made it almost impossible to end slavery peacefully. Those who owned enslaved individuals didn't want to lose their wealth. They didn't want to give up free labor or face the collapse of the system that had made them powerful. So they fought to protect it. They wrote laws to defend it. They built an entire political and social structure to justify it. And slowly, they convinced themselves and others that slavery was natural, necessary, even moral. It wasn't just a crime against humanity. It was a carefully constructed economic machine powered by human suffering. But here's the truth. No profit justifies treating human beings as property. No economic benefit can make that right. The fact that slavery was profitable only explains why so many people were willing to defend something so deeply wrong. In Celia's story, this economic system played a silent but central role. Even while she was being cruelly mistreated, she was still considered valuable property. The moment the legal system sided with her, if they had said an enslaved woman had the right to defend herself, it would have destroyed the foundation of slavery. Because if the enslaved were recognized as human beings with rights, the entire system would collapse. From an economic point of view, Celia had to be found guilty. The system couldn't afford her freedom. Too much money, too much power, too many fortunes were tied to the belief that people like her had no rights. It's horrifying, but it's important to understand, because it shows how greed can twist justice, how the pursuit of profit can blind entire societies, and how money can become more important than morality. Celia's story didn't end with her. It didn't end even after her death. Its impact stretched far beyond her life, touching her children, her community, and generations that followed. Her children grew up without their mother, knowing she had been taken from them by the same system that enslaved them. Imagine what that does to a child's heart, to know that your mother was punished by the law for trying to survive. That pain doesn't vanish. It becomes part of a family's story, passed down like an invisible inheritance. Even after slavery ended, the trauma remained. Families carried memories of loss, fear, and injustice. They learned that the law had not protected them, and that deep awareness of inequality echoed for centuries. The trauma of slavery didn't stop in 1865. It lingered in stories whispered between generations. Parents told their children to be careful, to stay quiet, to survive, because they had seen what happened to those who resisted. This is what we mean by generational trauma, pain so deep it travels through time. The descendants of enslaved people still live with that legacy today. They live in a society built on slavery, shaped by laws and systems that never fully disappeared. Celia's story is one small part of that vast history, one voice among millions, but every individual story matters. Every person who suffered deserves to be remembered, because those individual acts of cruelty built the foundation of the world we live in. Acknowledging that truth is the first step towards something better. We can't undo what happened to Celia. We can't bring her back or give her the justice she was denied, but we can learn from her. We can ensure that the systems we build today don't repeat those injustices. We can create a world where no one's humanity is questioned, where the law protects everyone equally, and where stories like Celia's are taught, remembered, and honored. To understand Celia's experience fully, we have to look at what it meant to be an enslaved woman. Their suffering was different, deeper in many ways, because they faced forms of control that men did not. Enslaved women carried a double burden. They were forced to work, but were also vulnerable in other, more personal ways. They could be coerced into relationships they didn't choose. They could be forced to bear children who would automatically be born into slavery. This was cruelty beyond comprehension. A mother knew that any child she brought into the world would never truly be free. She could not protect them, could not secure a better life for them. She could only watch as they grew up in the same chains she wore herself. And when those children were fathered by the men who owned them, the situation became even more painful. Those children often looked like their fathers. They were half related to the very families that enslaved them. Imagine the confusion and heartbreak of that, to love your child, yet be reminded every day of the injustice that created them. White families often knew what was happening, but silence was easier than truth. Many plantation households lived with this secret shame, mixed-race children who were hidden, ignored, or treated as outsiders. Everyone pretended not to see what was obvious, because acknowledging it meant admitting the brutality of the system itself. So these children existed in an impossible space, related by blood, yet denied their humanity. They were family, yet enslaved. Their very existence exposed the lies that white society told itself to justify slavery. Celia's own children lived this painful reality. If Robert Newsom was their father, and most historians believe he was, then they were related to his legitimate children, yet were never treated as family. They were treated as property. They grew up knowing that their father had owned them, and that their mother had died because she tried to protect herself from him. How do you carry that knowledge? How do you grow up under that shadow? The truth is, you don't recover easily. You survive, you move forward, but the pain becomes part of you. It shapes who you are and how you see the world. And that's what makes Celia's story so haunting. It's not just about what happened to her. It's about everything her story reveals: how power can destroy empathy, how the law can betray justice, and how ordinary people can live their whole lives inside systems that dehumanize others. Celia's story is not ancient history. It's a mirror, one that shows us how easily humanity can be lost when power and profit take control. Her courage, even in the face of impossible odds, remains a reminder that every voice matters. And though the system tried to silence her, her story continues to speak, across time, across generations, asking us to listen and to do better. Celia's case reveals something deep about human society: the difference between what is legal and what is right. The law said Celia had no right to protect herself. The law said she must be tried, convicted, and executed. Everything followed the official rules. Every step was done by the book. And yet, justice was never served. Justice would have meant protecting Celia from harm before it ever began. Justice would have meant recognizing her humanity and her right to safety. Justice would have meant understanding that she acted out of fear and self-defense, not malice. But the law failed her. It failed because it was written by those who never intended it to protect people like Celia. The law reflected the beliefs of those in power, and those beliefs were wrong. Even today, we still face this same struggle. We create laws to uphold fairness, yet sometimes those laws protect privilege instead. Sometimes they preserve inequality instead of ending it. Following the letter of the law can still mean ignoring the spirit of justice. So what do we do when laws are unjust, when the system itself is broken? We speak up. We question it. We push for change. Progress only happens when ordinary people demand better, when they refuse to accept a system that protects the powerful and punishes the powerless. It's not easy. It never is. It takes time, courage, and persistence. It means standing up when silence feels safer. It means saying, "This is wrong," even when everyone around you says it's fine. Because if we don't, the same pattern repeats. Unjust laws stay on the books. Unjust systems keep operating. And more people suffer in silence, just as Celia once did. There were people who knew. People who lived near Celia. People who saw the signs, heard the whispers, and looked the other way. Robert Newsom's family shared the same property. The other enslaved workers must have known something. Even the neighbors likely suspected. But no one spoke. No one intervened. Why? Part of it was fear. Speaking against slavery in Missouri during the 1850s could destroy your life. You could be labeled a troublemaker, shunned by your community, or even attacked. Part of it was conditioning. Generations were taught that slavery was normal, even necessary. They were told that the enslaved were not fully human, and that lie numbed their conscience. Part of it was self-interest. If you owned enslaved laborers, your wealth and comfort depended on their oppression. To defend someone like Celia would have meant questioning your own privilege. And part of it, perhaps the hardest part to admit, was simple human weakness. It's easier to stay silent. It's easier to look away and pretend you don't see the suffering in front of you. It's easier to say, "There's nothing I can do." But silence is never neutral. Silence is complicity. When you witness injustice and do nothing, you help it survive. You become part of the system that allows it to continue. It's a painful truth. We like to imagine that had we lived back then, we would have been the ones who spoke out, that we would have stood on the right side of history. But most people didn't. Most people stayed quiet, convincing themselves it wasn't their fight. This isn't meant to shame them. It's meant to challenge us. Because the question isn't what would we have done then, but what are we doing now? What injustices today do we ignore? What suffering do we scroll past without a second thought? What systems do we benefit from while others are trapped beneath them? Celia's story reminds us that silence helps the oppressor, never the victim. It calls us to raise our voices, to speak up even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs us something. Because change has always started with those who refuse to stay silent. After Celia's execution, the world around her did not change overnight. It would take another 10 long years before slavery was abolished in America. 10 years of families torn apart, of children born into bondage, of dreams crushed under chains. When the Civil War finally ended, it came at a staggering cost: over 600,000 lives. Cities were burned, families shattered. The country was broken, trying to rebuild itself from ashes. And when freedom finally came, it was only the beginning. The period called Reconstruction brought a fragile hope. Formerly enslaved people voted, bought land, started schools, and held public office. For a moment, it seemed as though true equality might finally take root. But the promise faded quickly. Southern states passed Jim Crow laws, enforcing segregation and suppressing black voices. Violence and fear replaced the whips of the plantation, but the purpose was the same: to keep power in the same hands. The system changed its face, but not its heart. It would take another century and another movement to begin undoing those chains. The civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s reignited the fight for equality that people like Celia had died without seeing. Marches, protests, speeches, and sacrifice moved the nation once more. And still, the journey isn't over. The echoes of slavery linger, in inequality, in discrimination, in the quiet injustices that persist today. We are still walking the road that began centuries ago. Celia never saw freedom, she never saw justice, but her story became a spark that lit fires in the hearts of those who came after her. Her suffering revealed the cruelty of a system built on dehumanization. Her courage inspired others to say, "Enough." Every step toward freedom, every voice raised for justice, carries the weight of people like Celia, people whose names history tried to erase, but whose strength continues to guide us. Celia's story is not just about the past, it's a mirror. It asks us who we are, what we tolerate, and what kind of world we're willing to build. Because the difference between law and justice still matters. Because silence still kills change. And because the long road toward equality continues, one act of courage, one voice, one story at a time. So, what do we owe to Celia? What do we owe to every person who lived, suffered, and struggled under the weight of slavery? And what is our responsibility now, in the present, toward their memory? First, we owe them the truth. We owe it to them to tell their stories with honesty and respect, not to soften the facts, not to rewrite history into something comfortable, not to hide behind myths about good masters or happy slaves, but to face the truth, as painful as it may be, about what slavery truly was, about the pain it caused, about the generations it broke, and about the incredible strength and humanity of those who endured it. Second, we owe them acknowledgement. We must have the courage to say, clearly and without hesitation, that what happened was wrong, that it was a crime against humanity, a wound so deep that its marks are still visible today. We owe it to them to recognize that the echoes of that injustice still shape our societies, our systems, and sometimes even our hearts. Acknowledgement is not about guilt. It's about truth, and it's about healing. Third, we owe them action. Not just words, not just sympathy, but real, tangible action. We owe it to them to stand up against racism and inequality in all its forms, to challenge systems that were built upon injustice, to create a world where dignity, fairness, and compassion are more than just ideals. They are the foundation of how we treat one another. We owe it to them to ensure that history does not repeat itself in new forms. Celia cannot be brought back. Her voice was silenced long ago. She cannot be given the life she deserved or the justice she was denied. But we can honor her by learning from her story, by allowing her courage and pain to change us, to awaken empathy within us. We can carry her memory forward as a reminder that justice is not a gift. It's something we must build, protect, and defend every single day. That is what we owe her. That is what we owe to all of them. Not just thoughts, not just sorrow, but real change. Real commitment to a world where everyone is treated with dignity, where every human life has equal worth, where no one is denied their humanity. We owe them a world that reflects what they were never given: safety, freedom, and respect. You might be wondering, why focus on one person's story? After all, millions of people lived and died in slavery. Millions suffered beyond what words can describe. Why single out Celia? Because one story can speak for a million. Statistics tell us how many, but stories tell us who. When we say that millions were enslaved, it's horrifying, but it's distant, abstract, almost too big to truly feel. But when we hear about one person, about Celia, a young girl who was taken from her home, forced to live a life not her own, who fought for her dignity and was punished for daring to resist, it becomes real. It becomes human. It becomes something we can understand in our hearts. One story has the power to break through the numbers and touch the soul. It transforms history from ink on a page into something living, breathing, and deeply personal. It allows us to see the people behind the history, their hopes, their fears, their love, their pain. It reminds us that these were not faceless names in a textbook. They were people with dreams, families, and emotions just like ours. Celia's story represents countless others: women, men, and children whose names we will never know. People who endured unimaginable hardship, and yet, in their own quiet ways, resisted it. People who fought to keep a sense of self in a world that denied them everything. Her story gives voice to theirs. It stands as a symbol of strength and defiance in the face of cruelty. It carries the weight of all those untold stories, all those unheard voices, all those forgotten lives. We cannot tell every story. Many were never written down. Many were erased or lost to time. But when we tell Celia's story, truthfully, compassionately, and without turning away, we honor all of them. We give acknowledgement to every person who lived through the same injustice, who fought back in whatever way they could, who dreamed of freedom even when it seemed impossible. That is the power of one story. It becomes a mirror for humanity, reflecting both the darkest parts of our past and the brightest possibilities of our future. It reminds us that even in the depths of oppression, there were people who stood up, who spoke, who resisted. And it challenges us to ask, what will we do with the freedom they never had? Celia's story is not just a chapter in American history. It is a lesson for all time. It is a call to remember, to reflect, and to rise. Because if one story can awaken our empathy, then many stories told together can change the world. We've covered a lot in this story. We've talked about Celia's life and the painful injustice that defined it. We've looked at the laws that failed her, the system that betrayed her, and the world that allowed it to happen. We've explored the history that shaped her time and how those same forces still echo around us today. But before we end, there's something deeper we need to face. Because the truth is, the work isn't finished. The struggle for equality, dignity, and justice didn't end in the 1800s. It continues, quietly and loudly, in the world we live in now. We still live in a society built on the foundations of that past. We still see inequality, sometimes in laws, sometimes in opportunity, sometimes in the silent ways people are treated differently. The story of Celia isn't just a chapter from long ago. It's a mirror, a reflection that asks us uncomfortable questions about who we are and who we want to become. So what do we do with that reflection? What can any of us do? We start with awareness. We learn, not just the polished, comfortable version of history, but the truth. The stories of people like Celia, the realities that textbooks often leave out. We learn not just to know, but to understand. Because knowledge changes the way we see the world, and once you see clearly, you can't unsee it. Then we speak up. When something isn't right, say so. When you witness injustice in your community, in conversation, online, don't stay silent. Silence protects the system that harms others. Your words, your courage, your willingness to stand up, those things matter more than you realize. And finally, we act. We support organizations working for fairness. We listen to voices that have been ignored for too long. We vote for leaders who believe in equality and accountability. We show up for others, for what's right, for the world we want to build. Celia never got justice. Her voice was silenced by a system that didn't recognize her as fully human. But today, we can give her something she never had: remembrance, recognition, and meaning. We can continue the work that she and so many others began simply by surviving, resisting, and refusing to accept a world built on cruelty and control. That's how we honor her memory. That's how we turn tragedy into purpose. That's how we finish the unfinished work. The work of building a world where every person's humanity is acknowledged, protected, and valued. Celia was one young woman in Missouri, a name almost lost to history. But her story matters. Her life mattered. And what happened to her forces us to confront the darkest truths about our past. Because when we forget history, we risk repeating it. When we ignore the stories of those who suffered, we erase their humanity a second time. And when we choose comfort over truth, we close our eyes to the lessons that history is trying to teach us. So remember Celia. Remember that she was real, a person with emotions, with hope, with fear. Someone who dreamed of peace, of freedom, of simply being treated as a human being. She lived through years of pain, isolation, and fear. And when she could endure no more, she fought back, because she had no other choice. And for that act, the law condemned her. That was called justice in her time. That was considered acceptable. And that's why her story matters, because it reminds us how easily laws can be written to protect power instead of people. Now that you know her story, the question is, what will you do with it? Will it just be another sad story you scroll past? Or will it stay with you? Will it stay with you? Will it make you see things differently, speak differently, act differently? Those are the questions that turn history from words on a page into something living, breathing, and meaningful. Something that shapes who we become. Celia's story is heartbreaking. It's difficult, but it's also necessary. Because her courage, even in her darkest moments, is a reminder of how strong the human spirit can be, even when the world tries to crush it. Don't let her story fade into silence. Don't let it be reduced to a line in a history book. Let it live on through you, through awareness, compassion, and action. Let it remind you that progress is never automatic. It's something we must keep fighting for every single day. That's what we owe her. That's what we owe all who endured the unendurable. And that's how we make sure their suffering was not in vain. The story of Celia is not an easy one to hear. It's painful. It's disturbing. It forces us to look directly at the darker parts of our past, at the ways human cruelty can hide behind laws, traditions, and the word respectable. But these are exactly the stories that must be told. Because history that feels comfortable doesn't teach us anything. Comfortable history makes it easy to believe that the world was always fair, that justice somehow sorted itself out, that all the wrongs of the past belong to another time and another people. But that's not the truth. Real history is complicated. It's full of injustice, heartbreak, and courage that often went unrecognized. It's about real people, people who lived, who felt, who dreamed, and who suffered. And if we truly want to learn from it, we have to be willing to face that pain. We have to listen to the difficult stories. We have to let those stories challenge us, make us uncomfortable, and push us to see the world differently. Celia was just 14 when her life was taken from her control. By the time she was 19, she was gone. She never had the chance to grow old, to see her children's faces light up with freedom, to live a life of safety and dignity. Most of her short years were filled with struggle and sorrow. She was denied justice, but her courage left a mark that time could not erase. Her story could have disappeared completely. It could have been buried in silence, forgotten like so many others, but it survived, because people refused to let it fade. Historians uncovered it, studied it, and brought her truth back to light. And now you know her name too. What happens next? That part is up to us. You can choose to turn away, to move on, to file it under tragic history. Or you can let it mean something. You can let it change the way you see justice, equality, and the value of every human life. You can let Celia's story remind you that real change begins with remembering, and with refusing to accept silence where there should be truth. Celia's life was short, but her story endures. It stands as a quiet voice across time, reminding us that even in the darkest chapters of history, the human spirit still sought freedom, still fought for dignity, still mattered. And that's why we tell her story. Not to reopen old wounds, but to make sure they finally heal the right way, through truth, remembrance, and the will to be better than the world that failed her.